The moment the doctor told us that our twin boys were conjoined, I felt my world tilt. But I wasn't scared, I was their mother. They were mine, no matter what. I turned to my husband, expecting him to hold my hand, to tell me we'd get through this together. Instead, I saw something I never expected. Disgust. He didn't say a word. Just turned his back and walked out of the hospital room. At first, I thought he needed air. Time to process. But hours passed. Then a full day. He never came back. Instead, I got a text. I can't do this. I'm sorry, but I didn't sign up for this kind of life. Take care. That was it. A 25-year marriage ended with a text. I should have broken down. But I couldn't afford to. My boys needed me. So, I did what I had to do. I wiped my tears, signed the surgery papers alone, and prepared for the hardest fight of my life, raising conjoined twins as a single mother. I had no idea then what the future held. But one thing was certain, he would regret this. And 25 years later, when he finally knocked on my door, I was ready. Because my sons weren't the helpless babies he had abandoned anymore. They were millionaires. And they had been waiting for this moment, too. The day I brought my sons home from the hospital, I felt the weight of the world on my shoulders. My husband had vanished without a trace. No calls, no support, nothing. I had to face the reality of raising conjoined twins alone. Doctors had told me their separation surgery would be complicated, maybe impossible. But that didn't change my love for them. Michael and Matthew were perfect to me. Money was tight. I had to quit my job to take care of them full-time. Some days, I skipped meals just to afford their medical needs. People stared at us in public. Parents pulled their children away. Some even whispered, "Poor woman, those babies shouldn't have been born." But I refused to let my sons feel unwanted. Instead of drowning in pity, I taught them resilience. I made sure they knew they were not a mistake. Michael and Matthew were brilliant from a young age. They learned faster than most kids, despite their physical challenges. And they had a bond stronger than anything I had ever seen. Then when they were 10, a miracle happened. A specialist took interest in their case. He believed he could safely separate them. But the surgery would cost more than I had ever earned in my entire life. I almost gave up hope. Until my sons made me promise never to beg their father for a cent. "We don't need him, Mom," Michael had said. "We have you." And so, I fought harder. I took 3 jobs. I applied for every grant. I sold nearly everything I owned. And somehow, after years of struggle, I raised enough money for their surgery. When they were 15, Michael and Matthew were successfully separated. For the first time, they had their own bodies. And for the first time, they began their journey towards something incredible. I thought my biggest battle was over. I had no idea the real storm was yet to come. Michael and Matthew had never let their past define them. From the moment they were old enough to understand what had happened to them, they channeled their pain into purpose. At 20, they co-authored their first book, Bound by Birth, Freed by Fate. It was their raw emotional journey, from being conjoined at birth to the grueling separation surgery that gave them their own identities. The book took off in ways none of us could have imagined. They made headlines worldwide, featured on talk shows, and became the voices for children born with similar conditions. Publishing houses competed for the rights to their story. They signed deals for documentaries, speaking engagements, and follow-up books. They didn't just become successful. They became millionaires. But beyond wealth, they gave back. They started a foundation that funded separation surgeries for conjoined twins from low-income families. They sponsored medical research. They created support networks for parents who felt lost, just as I once had. Their kindness spread far and wide. And then one day he came back. At first, it was just a phone call. A number I didn't recognize. I answered, only to hear a voice I hadn't heard in 25 years. "Claire, it's me, Robert." My stomach twisted. I was silent for a moment, gripping the phone tight, my breath heavy. "Claire, please. I need to talk to you," he stammered. I almost hung up. But then he said something I never expected. "I'm sick," he choked out. "Terminally ill. I don't have much time left." I stayed silent. "I made mistakes," he continued. "I was young, stupid. I was scared. I know I don't deserve anything from you, but I need help. I need their help. There it was. Not an apology. Not genuine regret. Need. He wasn't reaching out because he suddenly loved his sons. He was reaching out because he needed money. I swallowed the anger rising inside me. You walked away when they were babies, I said, my voice cold. You left them to die. And now you want their help. I know I don't deserve it, Claire. But I have no one else, he whispered. I inhaled sharply. Then with every ounce of strength I had, I said, then you have nothing. And I hung up. I thought that was the end of it. But Robert wasn't done. After I refused to help, he went after the boys. He reached out to Michael and Matthew, begging for a meeting. They refused. He called their secretaries. Their security teams were instructed to never let him near their offices. So he did the unthinkable. He went to the media. Within days, headlines exploded online. Millionaire twins abandon their dying father. Philanthropists who help children ignore their own parents' pleas. Heartless sons leave their father to die after he reaches out for help. Social media erupted. People who once admired them turned against them. Strangers flooded their social media pages, attacking them, calling them ungrateful, selfish, cruel. The hypocrisy was deafening. My sons had spent years helping families, giving hope to children who had no one. Yet now, they were being shamed for not saving the very man who abandoned them? I knew what had to be done. Michael and Matthew did too. Their next book was already in the works. But now, they added one final chapter. A chapter that would change everything. Michael and Matthew had never been ones to seek revenge. They had spent their entire lives proving that their father's abandonment did not define them. But this was different. Robert had gone too far. He hadn't just resurfaced after 25 years to ask for help, he had manipulated the world into turning against them. For the first time in their lives, they were painted as villains. Michael received emails from furious fans demanding to know why he wouldn't forgive his dying father. Matthew's foundation lost donors overnight. People who had once praised them now called them ungrateful, selfish, heartless. Robert had framed himself as a desperate, dying father seeking forgiveness from the children he never stopped loving. And the world believed him. Until the book came out. Michael and Matthew had already been working on their second book, but after this, they added an explosive new final chapter. It detailed everything. The day their father walked out on them. How he abandoned me at the hospital when I was at my weakest, with 2 newborns who might not survive. How he never looked back. How he had never once tried to reach out, until he found out they were millionaires. The book was titled From Pain to Passion. And when it was released, the world turned on Robert. The same media that had rushed to defend him now picked apart his lies. News channels aired the truth, not his version but ours. Clips of old interviews resurfaced, ones where I had spoken about raising my sons alone. Journalists who had once painted Robert as a tragic figure now called him out for what he truly was, an opportunist who abandoned his family and returned only when it suited him. But it wasn't just the media that tore him apart. It was the people. The same strangers who had attacked my sons now turned on Robert. You left them as babies, and now you want their money? You don't get to demand forgiveness after 25 years. You don't deserve their help. You deserve their silence. Robert tried to fight back. He went on talk shows, crying about how he had made mistakes, but just wanted a chance to make things right. But it was too late. No one was on his side anymore. He had lost everything. And for the first time, he had to face the full weight of his actions. But this wasn't the end. Because Robert wasn't finished yet. Not by a long shot. And his next move was something none of us saw coming. Robert was finished in the public eye. No one believed his sob story anymore. The media had abandoned him, the public had turned on him, and whatever pity he had managed to scrape together was now gone. But he wasn't done. Not yet. When playing the victim didn't work, he changed tactics. He decided to play the law. One morning, Michael and Matthew's lawyer called. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "Your father is suing you." Suing? For what? Robert had filed a lawsuit demanding financial compensation from his sons. He claimed that because they were his biological children and he was terminally ill, they had a legal obligation to support him. He was asking for a large sum of money, enough to cover his medical expenses, debts, and pain and suffering. The nerve. The pure audacity of it. He abandoned them at birth. Never paid a single cent toward their care. And now, after 25 years, he was trying to legally force them to give him their money? Michael and Matthew were furious. I had never seen them this angry before. Not even when Robert first resurfaced. This was another level. Because it wasn't just about money. It was about control. Robert was trying to prove that even after all these years, he could still have power over them. He had walked away when they were infants, helpless, voiceless, powerless. But now, they weren't those helpless babies anymore. They were men. Men who had built their own legacy. And they weren't going to let the man who abandoned them take a piece of it. The lawsuit made headlines. People were shocked. The same audience that had once defended Robert turned against him even harder. How do you abandon your kids and then sue them? This man has no shame. He deserves nothing. The case went to court, but it didn't last long. The judge shut it down immediately. Robert had no legal ground to stand on. He had never paid child support. Never contributed to their upbringing. The law was not on his side. His case was thrown out in less than 10 minutes. The final blow? The judge told Robert that if anything, the twins had a stronger case to sue him, for abandonment, neglect, and emotional distress. But they didn't. Because unlike their father, they had dignity. They didn't need revenge. They had already won. But this wasn't just a courtroom victory. It was the end for Robert. He had burned every last bridge. No one felt sorry for him anymore. His last desperate attempt to take from his sons had backfired spectacularly. And now? He had nothing left. Or so we thought. Because when people are truly desperate, they do unthinkable things. And Robert's next move would be the most shocking yet. We thought Robert had hit rock bottom. We thought the public humiliation, legal defeat, and complete rejection from his sons would make him disappear. We were wrong. Because when a man like Robert is desperate, he doesn't just fade away. He fights. And his next move was the lowest, most despicable act yet. The anonymous tip. One morning, Michael and Matthew's lawyer called again. But this time, her voice wasn't amused. It was serious. There's been an anonymous tip sent to the IRS and multiple media outlets, she said. My stomach clenched. A tip about what? Michael asked. She hesitated. About fraud. Michael and Matthew looked at each other, confused. Fraud? They were meticulous about their finances. Every dollar they made and donated was accounted for. There's a claim that your charity is a scam, the lawyer continued. That you're pocketing donation money. I froze. That was impossible. The twins had built their charity from the ground up. They were proud of it. They had helped thousands of children with complex medical conditions get the care they needed. And now someone was trying to destroy all of it. The investigation. Within days, the IRS launched a full-scale investigation. Bank accounts were audited. Transactions were scrutinized. And reporters? They had a field day. Millionaire twins under investigation for fraud. Charity scandal. Are they stealing from sick children? Where did the money go? It was brutal. Sponsorship deals were suspended. Corporate partnerships backed away. The same media that once celebrated them was now tearing them apart. And Robert? He was silent. But I knew. We all knew. This had his fingerprints all over it. He had failed to guilt them into giving him money. Failed to sue them. So now? He was trying to ruin them. The truth comes out. For weeks, the investigation dragged on. But in the end, the twins were cleared. Not a single cent was missing. Every dollar donated was accounted for. Their books were flawless. But the damage was done. The stress, the public humiliation, the betrayal, it took a toll. Michael and Matthew had trusted people. And now they couldn't. Their charity survived. But something inside them changed. They were hardened. Less open. Less willing to let people in. And as a mother, it broke me. Because Robert hadn't just tried to ruin them financially. He had tried to steal their faith in humanity. And that was something money couldn't fix. The final confrontation. One night, I found myself standing outside Robert's apartment. I hadn't seen him in person since the trial. I didn't even know why I came. Closure? Answers? I didn't know. But when the door opened, I barely recognized him. He looked old, tired. But when he saw me, he smirked. Finally, he said, "Here to talk sense into them?" My blood ran cold. He really thought I was here to help him. I took a deep breath. Then I said, "You lost, Robert. And you did it to yourself." His smirk faltered. "They will never forgive you," I continued. "Not after this. And neither will I." For the first time, I saw panic in his eyes. "I was desperate," he muttered. I needed them to listen." I shook my head. They were willing to forget the past. They had hearts big enough to move on. But you? You made sure they never would. I turned to leave. But before I walked away, I looked him in the eye and said the words that I knew would haunt him forever. "You abandoned them once." I stepped back. "Now they've abandoned you. And this time, it's forever." Then I walked away. And I never looked back. I walked away from Robert that night, but his war against my sons wasn't over. He was a man with nothing left to lose. And when a man like that is cornered, he does the unthinkable. After the IRS cleared Michael and Matthew, things started to settle. Their charity regained its footing. Their reputation rebounded. But they weren't the same. They had always been forgiving, compassionate. But now, they were guarded. They trusted no one. And even though Robert had been defeated at every turn, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Then one morning, Matthew's assistant called, and the terror in her voice sent chills through my body. "Claire, you need to come quickly." My heart pounded. What happened? "It's Robert. He's at the office. And he's not alone." By the time I arrived, the street outside Michael and Matthew's corporate office was a circus. Police cars, news vans, and at the center of it all, Robert, standing on the rooftop of my son's 20-story headquarters, with a camera crew below, filming everything. My blood ran ice cold. He had snapped. He was screaming into a microphone. "My own children left me to die. I'm just a father looking for forgiveness." The crowd below gasped as he staggered closer to the edge. "I have nothing left. Maybe this will get their attention." Panic erupted. He was threatening to jump. And I didn't know whether it was real or another one of his twisted games. Inside the building, I found my sons standing by a large glass window, watching the scene unfold. Their faces were like stone. I grabbed Michael's arm. "You have to stop him," I pleaded. "Say something, do something." His jaw clenched. Matthew shook his head. "This is what he does, Mom," he said. "He manipulates. He creates chaos. He wants us to panic." I felt sick. Because they were right. Every time Robert failed, he escalated. Every time they ignored him, he made bigger, more desperate moves. And now? He had put himself on the brink of death just to get their attention. I turned to my sons, begging. "If he dies, if he actually jumps, you'll have to live with it." Silence. Then Michael spoke, his voice low, heavy. "I won't be held hostage by his games," he said. And then, for the first time in their entire lives, my sons walked away from their father without looking back. Outside, the police negotiator tried to reason with Robert. But Robert wasn't listening. His eyes darted wildly across the crowd, looking for Michael and Matthew. But they weren't there. His last card, his final attempt to manipulate them, had failed. I watched as realization dawned on him. For the first time, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. Not the fear of falling. Not the fear of death. But the fear of irrelevance. The fear that his own children no longer cared. And then, the police moved. 2 officers grabbed him before he could do anything reckless. He screamed. He fought. But it was over. This time, for good. Robert was taken away. Not to jail. To a psychiatric facility. Apparently, his desperation had finally pushed him too far. I sat in the lobby of Michael and Matthew's office, staring at my hands. I should have felt relief. But all I felt was emptiness. How had it come to this? How had the man I once loved become this wreckage of a human being? I didn't have an answer. But one thing was clear. This wasn't our burden to carry anymore. Michael and Matthew had made their choice. And for the first time I knew. Robert had truly lost them forever. When I received the letter, I almost didn't open it. It had been weeks since Robert's dramatic rooftop stunt. Since the world turned its back on him. He had gone completely silent. Now suddenly, here was this. A plain white envelope with my name scrawled in shaky handwriting. I stared at it for a long time. Then with a deep breath, I unfolded the paper inside. And what I read shattered me. The letter. Claire. By the time you read this, I may already be gone. And maybe that's for the best. For so long, I've been running, from the truth, from my past, from myself. And worst of all, from you and the boys. I've spent 25 years convincing myself that what I did was because I had no choice. But that's a lie. I had a choice. I just made the worst one possible. I left. Not because I didn't love them. Not because I was disgusted or ashamed. But because I was afraid. Claire, when I saw them for the first time, something inside me broke. It wasn't their fault. It wasn't your fault. It was me. Because when I looked at them, I saw my mother. You knew she was sick. But what I never told you was just how much that broke me. I was 8 years old when my father walked out on us. Just gone. No warning. No goodbye. One day he was there, the next, he wasn't. And suddenly, I was alone with a mother whose body had betrayed her. She had Parkinson's. You never saw her in the worst of it. The shaking. The nights she couldn't move from bed. The times I had to spoon-feed her like a child because she had lost control of her own hands. I was a little boy taking care of a dying woman. And I did it alone. No one came to help. Family turned their backs. I spent my childhood bathing her, changing her clothes, cleaning up after her. And then one day she was gone. Just like that. Do you know what my first thought was when she died? Not grief. Not sadness. Just relief. And I have hated myself for that ever since. So when I saw our boys, when I saw them conjoined, I panicked. I thought, oh God, it's happening again. I'm going to be trapped again. I'm going to spend my life caring for them, watching them suffer, watching them need me, and I won't be strong enough to do it. I told myself I couldn't survive that again. So I did the one thing I swore I would never do. I became my father. I left. Claire, I have no excuse. None. I was weak. I was selfish. And I abandoned you and our sons when you needed me most. I will never forgive myself for that. And I will never deserve your forgiveness either. I didn't write this letter to beg for money. I didn't write it for pity. I wrote it because I don't want to die knowing that the only people I ever truly loved hate me. I just wanted you to know. I have spent every day of the last 25 years regretting that moment. Every day, I wake up wishing I had stayed. Wishing I had been better. Wishing I had faced my fears instead of running from them. I am so proud of them. Of you. You survived without me. You flourished without me. That is my punishment, and I accept it. I just hope that one day, even if it's not today, even if it's not in this lifetime, you and the boys can find it in your hearts to forgive me. And if you can't, then I understand. Because I wouldn't forgive me either. I am sorry. For everything. Robert. By the time I finished reading, I couldn't breathe. Tears blurred the words on the page. I had waited decades for an apology. And now, here it was. Raw. Heartbreaking. Too late. Michael and Matthew sat across from me, expressionless. I slid the letter across the table. Neither of them reached for it. Finally, Matthew picked it up. He read it slowly. Then passed it to Michael. Minutes passed in silence. When Michael finished, he set the letter down and exhaled deeply. Matthew finally spoke. His voice was hollow. It doesn't change anything. I bit my lip. It doesn't have to, I said softly. But maybe it explains something. Michael shook his head. He's just telling us his sob story now because he's dying. He didn't care before. Maybe, I admitted. But maybe he's telling the truth. They didn't respond. We sat there in that heavy, painful silence, each of us drowning in our own thoughts. Because whether we liked it or not, Robert's words had stirred something in us. Something we weren't ready to face. Are we ready to forgive him? Does he even deserve it? And if we don't, will we regret it when it's too late? After I finished reading Robert's letter, I sat in silence for a long time. My heart was at war with itself. For 25 years, I had hated him, despised him, lived with the scars of his abandonment. And yet, that letter, that damn letter, it was the first time he had ever shown any real remorse. And no matter how much I wanted to ignore it, his pain was real. But that didn't mean it was enough. Not for me. Not for my sons. I looked at Michael and Matthew. My boys. Grown men now. Strong. Successful. Resilient. But they were also scarred. Not just by their condition. Not just by the surgeries. By him. By what he did to them before they even had a chance to understand the world. And as I watched them sitting there, struggling with their emotions, I wondered, could they ever forgive him? Could I? I wasn't sure. But I knew one thing. We had to decide. And soon. Because Robert was running out of time. The letter burned in Michael's hand. I could see the war raging inside him. Then, with a heavy breath, he threw it down on the table. This is manipulation. Matthew didn't say anything. Michael's voice grew louder. He's just playing on our emotions because he's sick and alone. If he wasn't dying, would he be writing this letter? No. He wouldn't give a damn. He was furious. But beneath that anger, I saw something else. Pain. The pain of a little boy who had once wanted his father to love him. And never got that chance. Matthew finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. Maybe it doesn't matter anymore. Michael's eyes snapped to him. What? Matthew exhaled. Maybe we don't forgive him for him. Maybe we forgive him for us. His words hung in the air like a loaded gun. Michael scoffed, shaking his head. So you want to go see him? After everything? Just let him back in? Matthew's jaw clenched. I don't know. But if we don't do this, are we going to regret it? Silence. I swallowed hard. Because I knew exactly what Matthew meant. Hate was easy. It was a shield, a wall that protected us from feeling anything for Robert. But if we let him die without even hearing him out, would we carry that regret for the rest of our lives? Would we lie awake at night, wondering if we should have just faced him, one last time? I closed my eyes. We need to see him. Michael's head snapped toward me. Mom. Not for him. My voice was steady. For us. Because if we don't, we may never get closure. Michael ran a frustrated hand down his face. Matthew just stared at me, waiting. Finally, Michael let out a deep sigh. Fine. But I swear to God, if he so much as breathes the wrong way, I'm walking out. I nodded. Tomorrow, we would face the man who had abandoned us. One last time. The next day, we arrived at the hospital. The air was thick with tension. As we walked down the sterile white hallway, my heart pounded. I glanced at my sons. Michael's fists were clenched. Matthew was expressionless. Then we reached his room. Room 312. I hesitated, took a deep breath, and opened the door. When I stepped into the hospital room, it felt like stepping into the past. Robert lay on the bed, frail and unrecognizable. The man who once walked out on us without looking back was now barely holding on. His skin was paper-thin, his hair almost completely gone. His eyes, the same cold eyes that once turned away from his own children in a hospital, now held nothing but exhaustion. And regret. So much regret. The moment he saw us, something in him shattered. His lips trembled. Tears welled up in his eyes as he struggled to sit up. Claire. His voice was weak, barely above a whisper. You actually came. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My throat felt like it was closing up. Michael and Matthew stood behind me, stiff, unreadable. Robert's eyes moved to them, and he let out a soft, broken gasp. My boys. No one responded. For a long, excruciating moment, there was just silence. The the weight of 25 years pressing down on all of us. Robert tried to speak, but his voice broke. I don't deserve this. I don't deserve for you to be here. He wiped his eyes, but the tears kept falling. I should have been there. I should have been the father you needed. I should have been a man. His breath hitched. But I was a coward. I ran from you, just like my father ran from me. Michael's jaw tightened, but he still didn't say a word. Matthew, he was staring at Robert with something almost like pity. Robert turned to me, his eyes pleading. Claire, I know I don't have the right to ask for anything. But I need you to know. I never stopped thinking about you. About them. Every time I saw a story about conjoined twins, I wondered if they were okay. If they had survived. If they hated me. A bitter smile crossed his face. And now I know. I know I did the worst thing a father could ever do. And I know I will never deserve your forgiveness. His voice cracked again. But I'm sorry. I swear on whatever time I have left, I am sorry. Tears streamed down his face now, and for the first time, he didn't look like the monster I had hated for years. He just looked like a broken, dying man. A man who had ruined everything. And now, at the end of his life, he knew it. Michael clenched his fists so hard his knuckles turned white. Then, finally, he spoke. Do you know what it was like, growing up without a father? Robert flinched. Do you know what it was like for us to see other kids with their dads? To watch them play catch? To have someone to teach them how to tie a tie? His voice rose. Do you know what it was like for us to wake up screaming from nightmares, knowing the only parent we had was trying to be strong for us while breaking inside? Do you know how much I hated you? Robert squeezed his eyes shut, as if the words were physically hurting him. Michael took a sharp breath. His shoulders were shaking. Then, in a voice so low it was almost a whisper, he said, I don't hate you anymore. Robert's eyes flew open in shock. Michael's face was hard, but his voice was softer now. Hate takes up too much space in my heart. And I won't waste another second of my life giving you that power. So, I forgive you. Robert let out a sob. A real, gut-wrenching sob. It was the first time I had ever seen a man break down like that. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you. Matthew, who had been silent the entire time, finally stepped forward. He looked Robert straight in the eyes and said, We didn't need you to survive. But you needed us to live. And that's the difference between us. Robert nodded, more tears slipping down his face. Because he knew Matthew was right. He had spent his life running. And now, at the end of it, he realized the only thing that truly mattered were the people he ran away from. We didn't stay long. There were no hugs. No dramatic reunions. Just truth. When we left the hospital that day, I felt lighter. Like the weight of 25 years of pain had finally been lifted from my shoulders. Michael. Matthew and I walked out together, the way it had always been. We didn't look back. Because this time, we didn't need to. Robert passed away 3 weeks later. And for the first time in his life, he finally found peace. So did we.